All right, this is part 2 of database testing. If you didn't watch part 1, I highly recommend watching it first. So we left off here where we bought a book for user Tom, whose ID is 1. And now we're going to buy a second book with, let's see, with ID 2 for the same user. Okay, so let me go here. Create a directory db, and let me create our scenario. So user buy book test.json, and here we write our scenario with scenario name buy book user db testing, and we have steps. Right, so what do we want? We want to buy the book for user Tom, and we want to verify that user books table is populated with corresponding data, right? That's our plan. But before we execute the endpoint or invoke the endpoint of buying the book, we need to log in first, right? So I'll define a step file here, step file, and we will be using this step file, JWT login step. And this should look familiar if you watched my REST API testing. So I will say the placeholder sign and a value token, which is JSON file. And then we specify the location of our file, content / JWT login step.json. So this is our login. And now we need to actually buy the book, right? So name will be buy book. URL is, what is URL? Let's see. URL is API users buy book. So API users buy book. And the method, HTTP method, is post here. And we need to specify the request. First of all, since we are using JWT, we need to specify authorization header. So we'll say headers. And I need to specify authorization. And I need to get the bearer token from this step. So what do we do? This placeholder, then JSON path notation, and this is points to the root, and root is, in this case, the steps. So we want to go to the login, and this is the name here of the step, login. We want to go to response, headers, authorization, and as you might know from previous section, framework puts this bearer token in an array, so we use this 0 index, right? So this is our bearer token. We specify bearer token here. Now we specify the body of the request, and I will remind you that the body is user ID and the book ID. User ID is 1, so we are using this Tom user again, and the book ID is 2. Okay, this is the step for buying the book. We can assert things here. We can say that assertions, I will just assert the status that it is 200, right? So now comes the most important part. We want to check that this table, user books table, will be populated with user ID equals 1 and book ID equals 2. So let's define a step here. Let's say name equals let's say get user books data, something like that, URL. Now when we want to execute a method, and in this step we want to execute a method as we discussed in part 1, we need to specify the location of the class. So I already defined this class here. I will explain everything in just a minute. So we need to specify the location of this class relatively to this Java folder. So this will be db and .db utils, right? And in the method, we need to specify the name of the method, and we will be invoking this method. So let me copy this. And we need to specify the request. We need to pass some parameters to this method, what we are looking for. Basically, I will copy this because we want to construct an SQL query with these parameters. And we want to verify things. Let me leave it empty for now. And let me go to this class. Let's explore it. First of all, we have these injections for database URL, username, and password that we will inject from a property file. And this is our method. It gets a parameters, which is map. And here we get user ID, here we get book ID, and here we make an SQL query where we are just selecting everything from user books where user ID and book ID equals to these parameters that got passed, right? Next, I create this Jdbc template, and let me go here. And basically, I create a data source and I create this Jdbc template object, which comes from Spring. Now, you don't have to create Jdbc template if you don't want to. You can use Jdbc, plain Jdbc connection with prepared statements. That's up to you, right? The main thing is that you need to be able to execute some queries. Now you do that with Jdbc template or some native Jdbc connection. That is up to you. It's not defined by anyone. That's something that you make. Okay, so we get something that we can execute query on. In this case, I take advantage of this Jdbc template class because I'm using Spring. And I just execute this query, this SQL query. And if I find anything, if I find the information, I return this found. And if I don't find, then I return this not found. And finally, we have this wrapper, and we put our result under the key called result. So in our verify block, we can verify that result. If we found the data, corresponding data, it will return this found. So let me copy this. If we didn't find, this will return not found. Here, but let me delete this one. Okay, with regard to scenario file, we are pretty much done. Now we need to make a test here. This was just a utility class. This is not a test. So let me create a test here. I will say user by book test, something like this. We need to define a method here, public void test user by book. And we need to mark this as a test and make sure that it comes from org.junit. And we need to also define scenario here where we specify the name of our scenario. So db/user by book test.json. We need to specify the runner here as we did last time. So I will use this ZeroCode unit runner class. And obviously we need to define some properties because we need this URL, username, and password. And we also need some information about our REST API since we are invoking the REST API endpoints. So we need to define port, host, and optionally context as we did in case of REST, right? So I actually made a property file here beforehand called database properties. And this property file defines two things. So one is for the database, host, username, and password. And the other part is our information about our endpoint. Let me go here and specify target env, which is database.properties. And I think that we are pretty much done. So let me execute it. And it passes as we expected. So what we did, first of all, it was login and we got this bearer token back. Now we use that bearer token in our buy book here. We put it in headers and authorization, and buy book was successful. Operation ended successfully. And then we are checking that the data is populated in user books table. And this was the request, and this was the result. So let me go here in our database, not this table, this user book table. And as you can see, the corresponding data is here. The table is populated with user ID 1 and book ID 2. Okay, this was a typical example how you would approach database testing, and invoking this method, this feature is extremely flexible because we can put any kind of logic that we want here, right? We might even fetch some data from multiple databases. It's totally up to you. So framework gives us really good flexibility in terms of database testing. All right, this was all for now. I'll see you in the next one.